We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph from Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 82a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing a situation where there's a doubt whether the person owns the land or not. And in such a case, the Gemara says the person should bring bikurim from the trees. Let's say he owns the trees, but we don't know whether he owns the land or not. He should bring bikurim from the fruits of those trees. However, the Gemara says he should not read from the parsha. And the Gemara says, well, if he does not read from the parsha, so he might not fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara says he can do according to the teaching of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. What he can do is he can make sure that the taking of the bikurim and the bringing of the bikurim are done by different individuals. And in such a situation, there's an exemption completely from reading from the parsha, as the Gemara now continues. You have to have the taking of the bikurim of the fruits, and you have to have the bringing of the bikurim to be with the same person. And you don't have that. Let's say he appoints an agent for one part of it, and that could be a way of getting around the obligation of reading from the parsha. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravacha Breder Ravavi le Ravashi. Ravacha, the son of Ravavi, said to Ravashi, Mechdi, let us see. Psukei ninu. These are just psukim anyway. It's not like you're saying a bracha or something like that. It's just psukim. So likri, so just read it anyway. Let's say there's a situation of doubt. Why not just tell him to read from the parsha? And the Rashbam says, Mechdi psukei ninu likri v'amai ovid luhu k'd Rabbi Yossi. Why do you have to use the solution of Rabbi Yossi, of having one person taking the bikurim and the other person bringing them? Kemoshe mevi misafik, kachi he kori misafik. Just like you're bringing the bikurim in a situation of doubt, you can read from the parsha when it's a situation of doubt. Ka'adam shekori b'Torah, just like anybody who reads from the Torah, there's nothing wrong with reading psukim, so why not just read the psukim? And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said back to him, Mishum demichzi keshikra. The reason why you can't read from the parsha is because it looks like a lie. And the Rashbam explains, Mishum demichzi keshikra sharei b'shvil havoas bikurim kakari. He's reading because he's bringing the bikurim. V'shem alav b'karka shelo gadlo, but maybe it didn't grow in his field. V'kameshakar, and then he's lying. Uchsiv dover shkarim lo yachin l'negedei night, it says in the pasuk, you shouldn't speak falsely. Aval keshikori b'Torah lo mechzi keshikra. Just to read from the Torah, that doesn't look like a lie, but to read in this situation, the psukim, that would look like a lie. And the Gemara continues, Rav Mesharshia Brei de Rav Chia Amar Rav Mesharshia, the son of Rav Chia, says, Dilma asi lafkuinu mitruma u'maiser. The reason why we don't have him read from the parsha is because we're afraid there's going to be an exemption then from truma and maiser, which really should not be. And the Rashbam explains, Dil masi lafkuinu man dechazi, meaning somebody who sees what's happening here. Man dechazi, dekari alayu kebikurim. A person sees that he's reading the parsha like regular bikurim. Vadoim, as though it's real, certain bikurim. Keshayu lo bikurim ka'ela, when he has a situation like this with bikurim. Lo yafresh me'an truma. That person's going to say, I don't need to separate truma. He won't separate the truma, the kasavar bikurim vadoim. And he'll think it's certainly bikurim. Inami or hai gavra guve, maybe even this person himself. He's also going to get confused. Hilkach avid bu'akera, that's why we want to make some kind of distinction here, shelo likros, that he shouldn't read from the parsha, and that way we won't fall into this problem that the person will think that there's no obligation of truma and meiser. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Higdilu lo yeshava v'chulu. It said, let's say the trees grow, there's a lot of branches overhanging, so the seller is not allowed to trim those branches. This is talking about in a situation where the seller sells, for example, 2 trees to the buyer, so the buyer only owns the trees and not the land. So then we say that the buyer owns the trees no matter how much they grow. And then the Mishnah also said that in that situation, anything that grows from the stump of the tree, that belongs to the buyer because he owns the tree. But anything which grows from the roots, that belongs to the seller because he owns the land. And the Gemara says, Hechi dami min hageza v'hechi dami min asharash. Well, how do we know what exactly is considered to be from the trunk and what's considered to be from the roots? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Kol sharoa pnei chama, anything that sees the sun, meaning anything that grows above ground, zeu min hageza, that's growing from the trunk, that belongs to the buyer because he owns the tree. V'she'eno roa pnei chama, but if it doesn't see the sun, meaning it's growing from underground, zeu min hasharash, and that's growing from the roots, and that belongs to the seller because the seller owns the land. And the Gemara continues, but we should be concerned if you're going to give the buyer anything that grows from the trunk above the ground, so maybe the soil is going to build up around the tree, and therefore it's going to cover up that which grew from the stump. It's going to look like it's growing from the ground. And in such a situation, if the buyer is now owns this branch that looks like it's growing from underground, it essentially looks like he has another tree. Now maybe it looks like he has 3 trees instead of 2 trees, and he's going to start claiming the land. V'yamar lei, the buyer will say to the seller, T'lasa zavintali, you sold me 3 trees. V'isli aran, I'm actually entitled to land. In other words, we wouldn't allow the buyer to take something which could make it easy for the buyer to cheat the seller and claim that he has an additional tree and then claim that he has land. So it can't be that we're really giving the buyer these branches, which again could lead to this problem. And so the Gemara says, Alamar Rav Nachman, rather Rav Nachman says Yakotz. It doesn't mean that he can now grow this branch, he owns this branch, that it could maybe even eventually look like he has another tree. What it just means is he gets the branch, he can cut off the branch, and he can take the wood. That's what the buyer is allowed to do. V'chein Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan says the same thing. Yakutz, he's allowed to cut off the branch. That's what the Mishnah means to say. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman says, Nikitinon dekel ein lo geza. We have a halacha, we have a tradition, says Rav Nachman, that a palm tree, it does not have a geza, it doesn't have a trunk. Now, of course, it doesn't literally mean it doesn't have a trunk. It means to say that the halacha that applies to the trunk does not apply to a palm tree. And so the Gemara continues, Savar Rav Zvid Lameimer, Rav Zvid thought to say, ein lo geza lebal dekel. It means to say that the owner of a palm tree, let's say he owns the tree and not the land, he doesn't get that which grows from the trunk. Because since that tree is going to be dug up and uprooted, so therefore he has never considered that he would get these shoots that are growing from the trunk of the tree. And the Rashbam explains, Naktinon meraboseinu, we have a tradition from our rabbis, dekel ein lo geza, palm tree has no trunk. Lakame mefarish, the Gemara is going to explain what that means further on. Ein lo hayotzim and hagezel lebal hadekel. So the Gemara said that Rav Zvid thought to say that the person, the buyer, he doesn't get that which grows from the trunk of the palm tree. To kaven de lachbor l'sharish koi kishayive sha'ilan, because since he's going to just dig it up and uproot it when the tree dries out, the halo kanakarka, because he hasn't acquired the land over here, and again the tree is not something that's able to regenerate. So asuche mesach daite bal hadekel min ha'asid lotzes min hageza. The owner of the palm tree, he already has decided that he's not going to get anything from the trunk. He's already given up on that. To Savarhu, because he thinks Shema Yivesh Hadekel Mehera, maybe this palm tree will dry up quickly. Velo Yotzi Gezem won't have anything that comes out of the trunk. To Lo Dami Lashari Lanos, because a palm tree is not similar to other trees. Shem Yavshu Baroshan, because when it comes to other trees, if the top of the tree dries out, Kotzin Lamata, you can cut at the bottom, the Chozrinu Gedelan, and then they regrow, they regenerate. Shari Gizan Machlef, they have this ability to regenerate, Kedetanya Le'el, like we said in the Brisa earlier. Aval me'achar sheyivesh, but when it comes to a palm tree, once it dries up, ein lo takana. There's nothing you can do. There's no solution. Kedetanya le'el, like we learned in the Brisa earlier. B'tikalam u'va'arozim chofer mesharish. It said by palm trees and by cedar trees, you dig it and uproot it. Hilkach miyayish min hayotzim min hageza. V'lo neskaven l'knos. So therefore, the person has already given up hope from that which grows from the trunk. He has had no intention to acquire it, and that's why there's no halach over here of the buyer acquiring that which grows from the trunk. But the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rav Papa. Rav Papa asks the following question on Rav Zvid's explanation. But what about a case where a person buys two trees? In that case, the assumption is you are going to dig it and uproot it at one point. And yet it says in our Mishnah, that he is entitled to that which grows from the trunk. And the Rashbam explains, the case of our Mishnah, somebody buying two trees. The point of the question over here is that our Mishnah is not making any distinctions. It's talking about buying any two trees. It's talking even about palm trees. Even though you're going to dig up a palm tree, it's going to be uprooted eventually when it dies, because he doesn't own any land in a case where you buy two trees. Nevertheless, our Mishnah says that he is entitled to that which grows from the trunk. So therefore, our Mishnah essentially contradicts what Rav Zvid is saying. And so the Gemara continues, Papa says, Ein lo geza lebal dekel, the bal dekel, the owner of the palm tree, he doesn't get that which grows from the trunk. Lefisha ein motzi geza, because there's nothing that's going to come out from the trunk. And the Rashbam explains, Papa says, Lo tisli taima diasuach daita b'chofer mesharish. Don't say that the reason is because he gives up hope, because it's a kind of tree that you dig and you uproot. Ela ein lo gezel abal hadekel kedekaver. It is true what you said, that he doesn't get that which grows from the trunk. V'lo mitaimich, but not for the reason that you gave. The real reason why you don't get from a palm tree that which grows from the trunk is because it's not normal for anything to grow from the trunk. When you have a palm tree, all of the branches are at the very top. They don't grow out from the middle. That's why you have to climb it with a rope. Like we said, and it's for that reason. That's why the person has given up on getting anything from the trunk, because nothing ever grows from the trunk. And I guess even if it should happen that something happens to grow from the trunk, that would belong to the owner of the land. And so how do you answer the question from our Mishnah? Isn't our Mishnah talking about all trees? That was the question on Rav Zavid. And the answer is, that's easier to answer according to Rav Babba's explanation, because our Mishnah is talking about trees that normally do produce from the trunk. Therefore, it's not talking about a dekel, it's talking about a certain kind of tree. Because a dekel, a palm tree, doesn't normally produce from the trunk. Anything that a person is not thinking about, the buyer is not going to acquire. But the Gemara continues, Ulu Rav Zavid, Kasha Masnisa. Now, according to Rav Zavid's explanation, like we said, isn't there a difficulty from the Mishnah? The Mishnah does seem to be talking about all trees. It should include palm trees, that the buyer gets that which grows from the trunk. And the Gemara answers on behalf of Rav Zavid, the Zavin L'cha. The case could be where he buys the land for 5 years. It means he does buy the right for 5 years to replant in case the tree dies. And the Rashbam explains, well, Rav Zavid disrele demotzi geza. According to Rav Zavid, who holds that a palm tree does in general produce from the trunk, kasha masnisin. So then we have a difficulty from the Mishnah. Devecholi lonos hamotzi and geza mayri. Because again, our Mishnah is talking about all trees that produce from the trunk. And the Gemara answers for Rav Zavid, zavin le'lecha mishnin. The Mishnah is talking where he bought for 5 years, meaning he has the right for 5 years, sha'afim yomus, that even if the tree dies, but if it dies within the first 5 years, yita acher b'makomo, the buyer has a right to plant another one in that place. Therefore, since the buyer has certain rights to the land for this fixed amount of time, lo masech daite min hageza. So therefore, in such a situation, he is not giving up hope on getting from the trunk. But in a case, let's say, where he just buys without making such a deal, in that situation, even if it would die the next day or 2 days, he would uproot the entire thing. So Hasam over there, there in such a situation, he certainly does give up hope. He's not going to get anything that grows from the trunk. But again, in this particular case of the Mishnah of Zvid will say, where he has certain rights to the land for 5 years to replant, then already he won't be masech daite, and he'll be able to get that which grows from the trunk. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Kana shlosh, if a person buys 3 trees, Kana karkos, and then he does acquire the land. And the Gemara says, V'kama, how much land does he acquire? Amar Rabbi Bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Hareza Kana tachteyen uveineyen v'chutza lehen, he acquires beneath the tree, and between the trees, and around the trees. And the Rashbam explains, Tachteyen means tachas ikor hilanos v'hanofos, it means right under the main part of the tree and the branches. Uveineyen means karka megula shebein nofos ilan zeh lenofos ilan zeh. It's the area of land that's between the branches of this tree and the branches of that tree, even if it's an area that's not covered by any branches, but it's between the 2 trees, he gets that as well. V'chutzalan, and also he gets around them, means saviv hoilanos, he gets an area around the trees. Makom shekolin nofosein v'lachutz, even in a place again where there's no particular branches, he gets a certain distance around them, as we will see, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Beis Amud Beis.